So my name's Jayme Reaves, and I am a public theologian, independent. So I work with churches and organizations, community groups, multi-faith, interfaith groups as well, around issues of theology and public issues. So those who are interested in thinking theologically about public issues and stuff that's impacting the community. So my book that I've got at the moment is out in the back, and my specialty is around hospitality and the intersection of peace and conflict, theology and peace and conflict work. But I also do this work with a colleague who's based in New Zealand. So the flyers that you have say University of Otago, so David Toombs is based there, and so he and I are doing this work sort of around the world. He's got New Zealand and Australia. We've got another colleague that does South America, and then I'm doing sort of the UK and the US. And I live in the UK at the moment, but I travel back and forth, so I'm originally from the States. So to be responsible, I need to give you trigger warnings, right? So I will be talking about crucifixion, torture, rape, sexual abuse. So just so you know about that. And I also feel it's important, this is the first time I've done this, but I think it's important to sort of note that I'm a survivor of sexual abuse within the church. So while I'm okay, what happened was not okay. And so as we're talking about this, it's, it is personal for me, but at the same time, I think it's important to note that. So I'll start out with sort of setting the frame, and then we'll go from there. And unless you've been living under a rock, Me Too, you kind of know what that's about, right? So started actually in 2007. Tarana Burke was an activist who started the hashtag Me Too in the context of domestic abuse and violence against women, which also included sexual abuse. But it became part of the cultural zeitgeist, in the context of Alyssa Milano starting it on Twitter or recovering it on Twitter in relation to the Harvey Weinstein and the film and TV industry and sexual abuse that's there. Instantly it seemed to grow into something larger with women and some men as well, coming forward to talk about, and from all walks of life, to talk about their experiences that they too had become or were victims of sexual abuse in its various forms. And in the first 24 hours, the hashtag had been shared more than 100,000 times on Twitter, and by 4.7 million people in 12 million posts on Facebook. And that's just within the first 24 hours. It's obviously much bigger than that now. And statistics, we all are probably pretty aware of those. So the World Health Organization statistics are that 1 in 3 women, or 35% of women, have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner violence within their lifetime. I think that number is quite low, actually. And one of the issues with reporting around sexual abuse is people don't report it. We're finding stories, that's part of been the Me Too story, is that people haven't been talking about their experiences until now. So how are we actually able to accurately measure the amount of people who have actually been affected by this? But in the US, one of the statistics is that every 98 seconds someone is sexually assaulted, which means that every single day more than 570 people experience sexual violence. And again, those are the ones we know about. And that trans and disabled people are twice as likely to experience that violence than those who aren't trans and disabled. So the movement has spread across industries and disciplines, with women and again some men coming forward to tell their stories. And so there's been tributary campaigns, so Time's Up, Church 2, Silence is Not Spiritual, that have arisen out of this. And Church 2 started on Twitter with Hannah Posh and Emily Joy, who were here yesterday, or they're around, I think, and they were the ones that started that. And it served to link the Me Too movement to stories of abuse in the church and in religious communities, with mainly women, but not all, telling stories in which the religious communities they were or that they continue to be a part of have perpetuated violence against them. So we've heard stories of young women who were raped and assaulted by male religious leadership, and when they told somebody about it, they, the victims, were told to repent. Stories of women in relationships marked by domestic violence and sexual abuse who were told that they should submit to their husbands and their fathers, because that's primarily who was doing it, because it's what God wants. Repeated stories of men who publicly confessed to molestation and to sexual abuse and harassment and assault, but were praised for their bravery and honesty with no consequences. And another story that was in the UK of a woman entering into ministry into a progressive church. They recognize women in ministry, so that's one of the markers, right? And she's starting an internship, and a man complained to her senior pastor that he couldn't focus on the sermon when she preached because he couldn't not sexualize her. And their solution was to give him her preaching schedule so that he didn't have to come. So what's important about Church 2 and its evangelical counterpart, Silence is Not Spiritual, is that they're seeking to highlight the church's legacy of protecting abusers and the gendered ways in which we deal with these reports and these confessions that are happening. While in not all cases, a vast majority are women, and when has the church ever really taken women's issues seriously? So I think what we need to say is the Me Too movement and its tributary campaigns are reflective of a wider conversation that's starting to take this seriously. And it shows a rising awareness of people from all walks of life, every color, gender, sexuality, creed, class, are affected and have stories to tell. And I think our theologies need to follow suit. So in October 2017, a church in New York, Gustavus Adolphus Lutheran Church in New York City, did this sign, and you might have seen it on Facebook or on Twitter, where it says, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to #MeToo." And they were the first ones and the only ones that I've seen so far that have made an obvious public connection to Matthew 25's text and identifying Jesus in this Me Too story on a symbolic and a theological level. So I'm going to quote a little bit of Matthew 25. "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing." So I think it's safe to assume that we all, those of us sitting here and at this festival, we all understand that Matthew 25 invites the reader to see how we treat others as how we treat Christ. How we treat the most vulnerable among us, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the imprisoned, detained, and the naked. In the same vein, on a theological level, therefore, Christ can be identified with those who have endured sexual abuse. On a theological level, it's reasonable to make the connection that Jesus has shared in their suffering and can therefore be understood in sharing in Me Too. Acknowledging Jesus' shared suffering in sexual abuse at this theological level, I think, is important and yet rare. How many of us have really spent time on that, "and I was naked and you clothed me"? However, when whether it was intended or not, Me Too, I think, and David and I working together think, that it invites a more literal and historical understanding of Jesus' experience of sexual abuse. So you've got your handouts. I'm going to read it first, and then we'll talk about it, but if you want to read along with me. And I'll start actually one verse before. "So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And while saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews," they struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, and they put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to be crucified. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross, and it was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he didn't take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothing amongst them, casting lots to decide what each should take. So, like I said, this session is based on research that actually was conducted originally by David Toombs at University of Otago in New Zealand. And he explores crucifixion as a form of state terror and sexual abuse. And his article, if you want it, is on my website. So I put my card out in little places. So if you go to my website, you can find the original article where he researches this and shows more historical evidence. But to summarize kind of what he presents. So David's a liberation theologian, and if you're not familiar with liberation theology, it's a theology that's based in the lived experience of the oppressed and then reads the text through that lens, right? And so he was researching Latin American torture reports on abuses in authoritarian regimes in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala in the 1970s and 1980s. In these reports, and two clear patterns emerged. First, the torture operated as a form of state terror, which went beyond the immediate victim, the immediate person being victimized, to a much wider audience. And how they were able to do that is that torture might have been secret, and it might have been hidden from public gaze, and it slowly leaked out as far as within the community. The stories of what people were encountering slowly become part of what was happening, right? But the incidents became so frequent that it became to dominate and terrorize a wider society. So you don't invoke mass destruction, you start doing a few to then heighten the anxiety and heighten the terror that people are experiencing. So in other cases, especially in counterinsurgency campaigns in Central America, torture and executions could also be public, and in some cases involved visual spectacles that served as dramatic warnings to a society. Second theme is that sexual abuse and sexual violence were part and parcel of this experience, and it took extreme forms. So sexual abuses served the purpose of state terror as a physical as well as a psychological weapon. Sexual violence was used to humiliate and demean prisoners, both men and women, in ways that destroyed them both from the inside as well as from the outside. So drawing on these two patterns, David then went back and looked at the Roman crucifixion historical evidence, right? And he applies that because the crucifixion was considered supreme punishment. And so first, there's substantial evidence that the Roman Empire used crucifixion in the same way or in a similar way that he was seeing in the Central American stories, to terrorize and to intimidate a subjugated people. Second, that there's evidence that Romans stripped their victims and crucified them naked. There are references in ancient writings to the sexual violence of crucifixion, suggesting that the Romans intentionally used sexual violence to punish, to shame, and to dehumanize their victims. However, it's easy to miss it. We've sanitized this story. Jesus is hanging from the cross wearing a loincloth, and most of the times we see this. And it's easy to ignore its significance when we read the Gospels. So, I want to invite you as a group, maybe two groups now, since there's a few of us, on your own to read the text again. And what I'd like for us to do, so the little handouts, if you've just come in, the little handouts on the chair has the text on the back. And what I'd like you to do is separate into 2 groups, and let's do Lectio Divina. So 3 people, let's read it 3 times. So one person read it once, slowly. The next person reads it another time, slowly. And the third person read it and slowly, okay? And out loud to each other. And then let's come back and talk about what you notice, right? So can we do that? Do you guys mind sitting around each other? Okay. 3 times, yeah? Everybody's finished. So if you want to move your chairs, feel free, but you can also stay where you are. So what I want us to do, just to make sure that this is a safe space for everybody here, is at the moment, I want us to just look at the text, okay? Maybe for personal reflection, I statement sort of stuff, let's hold that for the question and answer time at the end, if that's all right. But let's dig into the text. So what words and actions in this passage claim your attention right now? What did you see that you've not yet seen?
Well, I saw Jesus' isolation. That he was not among the crowds that were saying Hosanna and laying down the palm fronds for him to walk, for him to ride upon when he entered Jerusalem.
Okay.
It was a very short period of time, and that he was isolated, and that they brought in the whole cohort, everyone that they could, who was ready to revile and despise him, and that it was a collective act. It was a collective action, and it made no difference that Pontius Pilate had found no fault in him, and had washed his hands of the affair.
Okay, so just in case anybody didn't hear, Jesus' isolation, that he's alone in this process, and that the whole cohort was called together, a collective act, and that there was no differentiation, or no difference that Pontius Pilate had not found him guilty, right? Or that he had been found not guilty. Okay, any others? Yeah?
I saw in a new way, or had questions about the purple cloak and crown of thorns. And Jesus a peasant. There's a kind of a mocking, a teasing, making sport of a humiliation. Anyway, I have a lot of I wonder questions about that.
All right. Okay. So yeah, humiliation, Jesus as a peasant, this purple cloak, crown of thorns. Yeah. What else?
I noticed that the sentence for which seems like it should be a critical thought person being crucified is like written in a way where it starts with an and then it adds all this other stuff into the sentence. And so at first I was like, that should be its own sentence. It shouldn't start with an because it's the most important thing. But it makes it all more demeaning that it's just one more thing.
Yeah.
Makes it like
Yeah. Yeah. If I don't mention it as we were going along, because it's a little bit of a side, somebody remind me of that in question and answer, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
The passerby being compelled.
The passerby being compelled.
So
Yeah.
the person, you get the impression this person is really not a part of this, but is being dragged into this act, not against, or you don't know what his will is.
Yeah. And what how did they compel?
Right,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. One more?
So I noticed that he's potentially naked 3 times in this. First, I assume they take his clothes off to put on the purple cloak, because later it says they strip him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him.
Yeah.
So they had to have taken his clothes off in order to put them back on.
Yeah.
So they take his clothes off to put the purple cloak on, and then they take off, put his clothes back on, and then when they're dividing his clothes among them, he's obviously not wearing them.
naked.
Which, yeah, like you said, I think we sort of sanitize that in our artistic interpretations of that. He's always wearing some sort of like adult diaper looking thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things that in this process, as we're reading the text, that's one of the things we want to highlight is how many times is Jesus stripped in this text, and we think it's at least 3. There might have also been a time previous to that with Barabbas when he had him, or not Barabbas, when Pontius Pilate had him flogged. What would be the point of flogging someone who's fully clothed? So there's something there as well. But is the stripping something that you have ever discussed before? Okay. That's something else we're noticing, that no one's ever really noticed this. And so just as an aside as well, during the Easter process, Lent, and if you're within a liturgical tradition, we strip the altar. And it is laid bare. And what does that mean? It's not to say it's a bad thing, but do we know what that is signifying? Stations of the Cross, where Jesus is, that is one of the things, is where he is stripped. And we don't talk about that. So, also the question, do you know how many is a cohort? Anybody familiar? Okay. So within Palestine, there was a legion that had been within the Roman Empire that was assigned to that area. And a legion is comprised of 10 cohorts. And a cohort is between 360 and 800 soldiers. 360 to 800. So the whole cohort was called. And the text implies that they're there and that Jesus is in the middle of it. Now, we are familiar with, stories in the news about sometimes how soldiers comport themselves. Abu Ghraib would be something that we would know from Iraq era. But soldiers are usually, in contexts of conflict, find it difficult to control themselves when an option to humiliate others is there. So, read into that what you would like. So let's pick this apart just a little bit more. So first, stripping was part of the mockery and humiliation involved in crucifixion. A clear and central element in execution was to strip the victim and display, most of the time, him naked on the cross. Second, this humiliation of naked display needs to be named, we think, as sexual abuse, in that its significance is to be understood and properly appreciated as humiliation, sexualized humiliation. The sexual abuse was not accidental, and it was not incidental to crucifixion. It's a part of the form of torture and execution, and it's intentional and it's integral. Crucifixion, therefore, we think needs to be recognized as a form of sexual torture and sexual violence. David Toombs writes in his article, based on what the gospel texts themselves indicate, the sexual element in the abuse is unavoidable. An adult man was stripped naked for flogging, dressed in an insulting way to be mocked, struck, and spat upon by a multitude of soldiers before being stripped again and reclothed for his journey, only to be stripped again and displayed to die whilst naked to a mocking crowd. When the textual presentation is stated like this, the sexual element of the abuse becomes clear. The assertion is controversial only insofar as it seems startling to view in our usual presentations. The sexual element to the torture is downplayed in artistic representations of the crucifixion that show Jesus wearing that adult diaper, that loincloth. And these images distance us from the biblical text, perhaps because that sexual element is a little too disturbing for us to confront. So, whilst our main focus in the presentation is on naming the stripping as a form of sexual abuse, it should also be the stripping is often a prelude to other forms of sexual violence. And although it's impossible to say with certainty, we really just don't know because the text doesn't say. Historical evidence is that the crucifixion was also prelude to other forms of sexual violence. Such as the mockery and the praetorium, and we can't rule out that other things might have happened. In some Roman passages, a strong and very disturbing connection is made between Roman crucifixions and impalement. And this is most obvious in passages from Seneca. There's two specific ones where he writes, "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but of many different kinds. Some have their victims with head down to the ground. Others have been impaled in their private parts, and others stretched out their arms on a gibbet." So there wasn't just one way people being crucified. So we often encounter objections, obviously, to this work as well. And the first is usually objection around historical evidence. And the historical evidence is there. If you care to see it, it's there. The second objection is often the assumption that's inherently insulting or demeaning to suggest that someone might have experienced sexual abuse. The clear implication is that if Jesus experienced sexual abuse, he's somehow less worthy, perhaps because he becomes less pure or less innocent than if he had not, right? So a few people have said, "Not my Jesus." So some people assume that a person who has suffered sexual abuse is therefore devalued and less worthy. And indeed, in many cases, they're seen as worthless. In more serious cases, this negative attitude means that women and men who have been raped in conflict are often abandoned by their partners or by their families or by their community and are cast out. Although many people deny that they blame victims, that we try to take the victims seriously, it becomes clear that in the practices that even if you don't blame the victims, we readily stigmatize them and judge them in negative ways. So hence the suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual abuse is to be fiercely resisted, as it would lower him in people's eyes. It's especially relevant in the churches. Respectable church people will invariably insist that they follow Christian teaching, that they care for their neighbors, and they extend compassion to the needy, but a negative attitude to survivors of sexual violence remains pretty close to the surface. And it's often experienced by survivors who feel shunned and stigmatized by how they're treated. In some cases, survivors are the targets of gossip and rumors. And in other cases, the negative attitude comes in through silence, and it's not talked about. So if a church never speaks of sexual violence and acknowledges those who have suffered from it, it can seem that the church doesn't want to know about it, and that the experiences of survivors is unimportant. Likewise, if the experience of survivors is never addressed in church, and it's easy to take this as a message that there might be something wrong with them. Either they did it, or they caused it to happen to themselves in the victim blaming sort of way, or that they have become something and they are stigmatized, or both, making them unworthy in the eyes of respectable church people. As noted, as we've talked about already, the negative view doesn't need to be explicitly articulated to be effective. We don't need to say they've been stigmatized. We don't need to say your story doesn't matter. It happens anyway. In some cases, it may be expressed in a very callous way. More usually, it's disguised by a veneer of respectability. But it remains close to the surface and leaves survivors lonely and isolated. So that isolation observation that you made is important. So what's especially interesting here, I think, is that the distinctive status of Jesus in Christianity strongly resists this dynamic. The easy default option of blaming the victim isn't available in this case. Jesus, the one person that we see within Christian theology, is blameless. And likewise, Jesus can't be politely ignored or overlooked as someone less worthy. Hence, the suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual abuse is so disruptive and so disconcerting to people that the notionally respectable Christian view can't continue. And it challenges the prejudice that a victim of sexual abuse is somehow at fault or irredeemably stigmatized or defiled by the experience. So, why is it important? It's not just a question of past history that can make it, this story can make a profound contribution to how we deal with victims of sexual violence, both within the church and within the community. The issue of stigmatization and not taking people's stories seriously is important. And so being able to look at it from a Christological perspective might help people who are not able to get there on their own to then start saying, oh my gosh, where are those who are experiencing this that might be in the same boat? So we claim that we genuinely feel that an act out of compassion and love, and we don't mean to insult or we don't mean to silence, but yet it happens. And so the suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual violence helps bring these negative judgments to the surface and to talk about them. So I want to open up to questions, and I think, I understand. We understand when we do these sessions that they're fraught, and it's difficult, and you're, oh my God, how have I not seen that? And this happens everywhere. So don't take it bad. But yeah, what questions do you have?